10 Star Trek characters we want in Lower Decks' final season. Star Trek Lower Decks Season 5 has the opportunity to bring back Star Trek characters from multiple Star Trek shows. Plenty of Star Trek The Next Generation era characters have been in Star Trek Lower Decks, which takes place in the 2380s, shortly after Star Trek Nemesis. Returning favorites have already included Star Trek The Next Generation's Captain William Riker, Jonathan Frakes, and Counselor Deanna Troi, Marina Sirtis, and Star Trek Deep Space Nine's Colonel Kira Nerys, Nana Visitor, and Quark, Armin Shimerman. Robert Duncan McNeil even pulled double duty, reprising both of his live-action Star Trek roles. Star Trek Voyager's LT Tom Paris and TNG's Nick Locarno. Star Trek Lower Decks prides itself on being in tune with some of the deepest cuts of Star Trek references, and Gabrielle Ruiz, who plays Lieutenant Tlin, says the guest star list in Star Trek Lower Decks Season 5 is sick. Taken together, this could mean more than a few surprises are in store for Star Trek Lower Decks' upcoming 5th season. The fact that it's Star Trek Lower Decks' final season means it might be time to pull out all the stops, with the USS Cerritos crew meeting characters from all over the Star Trek timeline, and not just the late 24th century. Here's a few familiar faces we'd like to see. Jake Sisko's Cirroc Lofton. Potential Star Trek Lower Decks appearance could be a more lighthearted version of the unrealized plan to put Jake Sisko in Star Trek Picard Season 3, which would have shown Jake as an investigative journalist hot on the case of changelings that had infiltrated Starfleet. Flashbacks show that LT Beckett Mariner, Tawny Newsome, served on Dis-9 while Jake was living there, so Beckett Mariner could be the link that gets reporter Jake Sisko connected with the USS Cerritos crew to research a story. Or maybe Jake just wants his sweater back from Sam Rutherford, Eugene Cordero. There are more nods expected to Star Trek Enterprise in Lower Decks Season 5, after tributes to Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Star Trek Voyager in Star Trek Lower Decks Seasons 3 and 4, respectively. Jolene Blalock's Subcommander T'Pol is from about as far back as you can go in the Star Trek timeline, but there's precedent for the women of T'Pol's family to resemble each other, since Blalock played T'Pol's ancestor Tamir in Star Trek Enterprise Season 2, Episode 2, Carbon Creek. A descendant of T'Pol could easily be alive and well in the time of Star Trek Lower Decks, with one of the USS Cerritos' savvy junior officers making the connection. In Star Trek Prodigy, Robert Picardo's doctor mentions the USS Cerritos crew offhandedly without giving any details about their previous interactions. While the Cerritos' lower deckers may actually be so dysfunctional as to be legendary, the doctor's comment still invites speculation about whether the USS Voyager's EMH may have actually crossed paths with the Cerritos crew, and if so, when. A guest spot in Star Trek Lower Decks could reveal the truth about the doctor's alleged experiences aboard the Cerritos, while also letting Picardo lean into the doctor's more comedic aspects. Since Star Trek Lower Decks celebrates the lowest-ranked Starfleet officers, Lower Decks is the perfect series to finally promote Garrett Wang's Ensign Harry Kim. Despite claims that Harry Kim belongs to Star Trek Prodigy, Star Trek Voyager's Forever Ensign remains remarkably absent from any modern iteration of Star Trek. An appearance on Star Trek Lower Decks would at least let us know that there's more than one pip on poor Harry's collar after the USS Voyager's triumphant return to the Alpha Quadrant. Otherwise, he'd have to call the Lower Decks characters Sir, and that would be kind of funny, but so embarrassing for Kim, pointing out that universally panned Star Trek episodes aren't as bad as they seem, so Lower Decks Season 5 is poised to call out the weirdest parts of Star Trek's 5th live-action series. That means the USS Cerritos' junior officers just might make the best of Star Trek Enterprise's disappointing final episode. These are the Voyages, and there's no one better to help them do that than Scott Bakula returning as Captain Jonathan Archer. Star Trek Lower Decks might reveal, in its characteristic quick-witted patter, how Archer's involvement in the founding of the United Federation of Planets really went down, since what we saw in These Are the Voyages was just a holodeck program. Better yet, Lower Decks' characters could run their own holodeck program, more or less like Commander Riker's, and put right what once went wrong. Star Trek Picard's fan favorite, Captain Liam Shaw, would be a much younger version of his gruff self in Star Trek Lower Decks' 2380 setting, but still very much a part of Starfleet since Shaw was present for the Battle of Wolf 359. An animated cameo featuring Shaw would recognize the desire for Star Trek Legacy without necessarily committing to anything bigger. Shaw would be a great by-the-book antagonist for the chaotic USS Cerritos junior officers, while also being someone who has more in common with LT Beckett Mariner than both might initially think. That could mean a classic Star Trek bonding moment for both Mariner and Shaw. Walter Koenig already has a character in modern Star Trek Federation President Anton Chekhov, the descendant of Star Trek, the original series Pavel Chekhov, who is heard in Star Trek Picard Season 3, Episode 10, The Last Generation. Since Star Trek Lower Decks takes place in the early 2380s, about 20 years before Star Trek Picard, the younger Chekhov would be in the earlier days of his political career. That time difference would make Anton Chekhov the equivalent of a lower decker himself, giving him something in common with the Star Trek Lower Decks main characters. Koenig could also theoretically reprise his original role of Pavel Chekhov in Star Trek Lower Decks, despite the 100 years difference between the series. Star Trek, the original series, George Takei set a precedent for TOS actors with Captain Hikaru Sulu's Star Trek Lower Decks appearance in Season 3, Episode 8, Crisis Point 2, Paradoxus, as part of Ensign Brad Boimler's Jack Quaid dream. Koenig's original Chekhov could be in a dream sequence like Sulu or be part of a holodeck program. With few details available about the exact time frame or plot of the upcoming Star Trek Section 31 movie, there's no reason that Michelle Yeoh's Emperor Philippa Georgiou couldn't wind up in the 24th century, courtesy of some Section 31 approved time travel. Or not. Georgiou doesn't care about your rules. There's even a logical reason for Georgiou to cross paths with the USS Cerritos. Star Trek Lower Decks introduced a plot where Ensign Brad Boimler's transporter clone, William Boimler, Jack Quaid, was recruited into Section 31, which needs to be resolved before Star Trek Lower Decks ends for good. Yuri Ryan's 7 of 9 was rejected from Starfleet fairly early after returning to the Alpha Quadrant, but it's possible Seven's stint with the Fenris Rangers in the Beta Quadrant hasn't started yet. Berlin actress Gabrielle Ruiz suggests that the sick guest cast overlaps with this season's girls' trip, so why not have 7 of 9 meet Mariner, Tendi, Noel Wells, and Tlin for a truly epic hang? Maybe it's a good old-fashioned heist. Maybe Tendi has family connections to the Fenris Rangers. And maybe the ladies of Star Trek Lower Decks inspire Seven to do good wherever she can, with or without Starfleet. After Star Trek Lower Decks' Beckett Mariner and Brad Boimler crossed over into Star Trek Strange New Worlds Season 2, Episode 7, Those Old Scientists, it's time for Strange New Worlds to repay the favor. One of Star Trek's many varieties of time anomalies could drop Lieutenant Spock, Ethan Peck, in the vicinity of Boimler or Mariner in the 24th century, prompting an entertaining reunion. Imagine Mariner trying fervently to explain that their new Vulcan friend totally isn't Spock, because he's way too young and that would be so weird. No, this is Tlin's hot cousin, Borg. Imagine Spock trying to play along. Of course, Spock isn't the only name from Star Trek Strange New Worlds that we'd like to see in Star Trek Lower Decks. Celia Rose Gooding as Ensign Nyota Uhura could join in on the Promise Girls trip and let loose a little bit, building off Uhura's scenes with Mariner in Star Trek Strange New Worlds. Rebecca Romijn as Number 1 almost has to meet real-life husband Jerry O'Connell's commander Jack Ransom, and Anson Mount's Captain Christopher Pike is always welcome. These are just our picks, but any names from across the Star Trek franchise will almost certainly make the guest list in Star Trek Lower Decks Season 5 amazing.